Okay, so here we are with part 3 of our lecture. And for this portion of the lecture, we're going to discuss Oedipus the King, which is a play from ancient Greece by an author named Sophocles. And it's our first example of what we would call like a primary source or a literary text, rather than like an article like we talked about in part 2. And as I said, usually our lectures will just be 2 parts, not 3. And usually they'll both be literary texts or primary sources. And the reason I've chosen Oedipus for this first lesson is a couple of reasons. One, it's a very old text, one of the most, you could say, foundational myths in Western culture, but also it really exemplifies the concept of catharsis. So hopefully part 2 explained why I think catharsis will be so helpful to us this quarter as a theme. But Aristotle, when he articulated the idea of catharsis in his book, The Poetics, he used Oedipus, which was a play well known at the time, as his source, his example or his basis. And so we're going to use, in this lecture, Oedipus as our example, call it a case study. So it'll be our first case study in how to do the kind of analysis I'm hoping we'll do this quarter, and then also a case study for us like it was for Aristotle in exemplifying catharsis. Before we dive into Oedipus, since this is our first discussion of a literary text or primary source, I want to discuss my learning model, which is the structure of each lesson. So, and moreover, I think it's just a really good, really useful structure for analyzing literature. And when you're done with this class, if you go on and continue to read or analyze literature, using this approach will be very useful to you. So first I go over historical factors, kind of the background and context. I say if relevant. I don't want to get too bogged down on historical context in this class because of the nature of this class being an introductory class. We're not studying one specific time period or place. So this will be usually very minimal and not always even there. That's why I say if relevant in parentheses. But with that in mind, that's only because this class isn't historically bound to a specific time or place like other more upper division classes usually are. And so I want to emphasize that I believe historical context is incredibly important. It's really useful to understanding the meaning of literature. So I'll provide what I can where it seems essential, but just as kind of basic best practice for yourself for future reference, always look into the historical context when studying a work. So the first step in the learning model is history. The second step is philosophy. And another way to think of these first 2 steps would be context and content. So this is where we get into the meat of the literary work. What is it about? What is it saying? What message is it communicating? What is the philosophy of the literary work? In this second step, where we interrogate the work and try to interpret its meaning, is accompanied by something I call close reading, which is really thorough analysis of actual language from the text. So we'll actually look at quotes. I'll put forward an idea or a theme or something, and then I'll put up a quote. And we'll say, how does this quote illustrate or explain what I'm talking about? Finally, the final step is pedagogy. So history, philosophy, pedagogy, or context, content, learning. Pedagogy is just a fancy word for learning. So I say, what do we learn from this text? What a value does it have to offer? This is the most important part. This is what I call the so what factor. Why does it matter? We can read great literature, but we shouldn't read great literature just for the sake of it being considered great. We should read great literature because it can teach us something. If it doesn't teach us something, it's not great literature. And the things that have been identified by scholars as great pieces of literature teach us something. And so we need to figure out what that is. So building on step 2, which is what is the meaning of this text, it is why is the meaning or message of the text important, relevant today? And I said before, I like to use the Socratic method when I teach in person, so everything is question-based. So even in part 2, I'll still have questions. And those are the questions where you could like pause the lecture and try to answer them yourself, and then unpause. And then in the final portion, the learning questions, those I'll just real briefly kind of mention, but not discuss in detail, because those are the questions you'll answer on the discussion board. So to sum up, I'll give you some historical background that may be useful. Then I'll pose some questions that are helpful to understanding the meaning of the text. And those questions will kind of replicate what we do in the classroom and basically suss out the meaning or the message of the text. And then third and finally, you'll go on the discussion board and build on that foundation I've laid in the lecture by answering questions that have to do with the meaning, significance, relevance of the message from the text. And that's, I think, where the most important work is done. And one of my favorite parts of the course is reading your discussion board posts. So now to Oedipus. I'm not going to give a lot of historical context for Oedipus because really I already did that in talking about catharsis. One of the reasons this text is famous is because Aristotle used it as his primary example to articulate his theory of narrative and his theory of catharsis. And so all else you really need to know is it comes from ancient Greece, primarily from the city of Athens is where it was performed, and that was the birthplace of drama. We've talked about the importance of genre in this class and learning to read the different genres. This genre is drama, so think of it as a play being performed on a stage. And it was one of the very first ones. And ancient Athens and ancient Greece is where most dramas were first performed and where the genre of drama was born. Another thing you need to know is that this is a pre-existing myth. So everyone in ancient Greece was familiar with the story of Oedipus before Sophocles wrote it as a play. And that's key because, as we'll talk about later on, the events of the play do not happen in chronological order. So Oedipus learns his backstory as we, the audience, do. But the audience at the time would have already known his backstory because it was a pre-existing myth that had been told out loud in ancient Greece for a while before Sophocles put it into dramatic form. So I think that's the only background you need. I don't want us to get bogged down with background and context. So as we dive into the content of the text here and try to interpret its meaning, I want to start by listing out some themes, what I call threads. I like to use the metaphor of pulling on threads when we study a literary text. So as you read, like I mentioned before, highlight things that seem important, make notes in the margins, try to paraphrase what happens in key sections in your own words. But as you notice that, you'll notice themes or ideas or images or symbols or patterns that repeat. Take note of those as well and maybe make a list of them if you can, and those are called threads. And so if we were meeting in person, I would ask, what threads did you notice while we were reading? And I'd make a list of them on the board, and then I'd probably have you divide into groups to discuss the different threads. Because we're doing this online, I'm going to list out some threads here that are things I noticed as I was reading. And then as we go, we'll go through each one and look at a quote from the text to see what the text does with this idea. And so I call it a thread because it's just something you observe at first. But after you make your list of threads, you go back, you pull on those threads. That's why the metaphor works. So you look and say, what is a theme? For instance, just as an example, the first theme I'm going to look at is Oedipus's character. So because he's the king of Thebes and he's the main character, who he is as a person is very important to this text. So that's the first thread I observed while reading. And so I'm going to go back now and re-examine what are the passages that seem to deal with Oedipus's character. What do I learn about Oedipus's character? So I'm going to pull on that thread, and as I do, more of the text will unravel. And so we'll learn more things by pulling on that thread. And so the idea is you come up with a list of things you notice as you read, And then you don't have to reread the whole thing, but go back, maybe reread certain parts, pull on those threads, see, what do I get if I re-examine the text specifically thinking just of Oedipus's character? And you can make further notes about what you learn just looking for that one specific thread. And then you could do it for other threads too if you have time. And again, if we were in a class, that's what you would do in groups, is pull on those threads, re-examine the text for those threads. So the first one we'll look at is Oedipus's character, and the Greek word ethos means character. The second one is irony. The third is blindness. The fourth one is fate. There are other threads or themes that are really important in Oedipus, and you can certainly bring up different ones in the discussion board, but these are the ones that stood out to me the most as I was reading. So since we're in an online format, these are the ones we're going to work with. So the first question I have, based on this idea of character or ethos, is what are your impressions of Oedipus? Is he a character you root for, that you like? Do you want him to be victorious in his goal? Why or why not? So this is a place where you could pause the lecture and try to answer the question yourself before hearing what I have to say about it, kind of simulating a classroom discussion, if you will. Something I'll point out real quickly that'll help us with this question is that, like I said, Aristotle really analyzed this text, and he was the first theorist to come up with a theory of narrative structure. And he talked about how a text needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and how a basic structure is you have a protagonist with a goal and an antagonist who gets in the way of achieving that goal, and how the protagonist combats the antagonist and works out that goal, eventually leading to the resolution, is a basic narrative premise. And so Oedipus has a really clear goal. There's a plague affecting his city. His goal is to root out the cause of that plague and put a stop to it. And so that's the basic kind of protagonist with a goal premise. I think who the antagonist is a more obscure but very important question. And so as we see Oedipus with his goal, I come back to the thread of character. Is he someone you root for? Is he someone you're hoping he achieves his goal? Because with protagonists, it can really vary. Sometimes we don't necessarily like the main character, especially in more recent novels. Sometimes authors will do that. So it's a legitimate question, an important one. But the passage I'm going to look at to pull on the thread and help us try to understand Oedipus's character better is from the very opening lines of the play, and it's when a priest is first telling him about the plague affecting the people of Thebes. And that is, what then launches him on his quest to rid his city of this plague. So that's why we're going to look at this quote first. Helping a priest to his feet. So this is a stage direction because it's a play. If you were seeing this performed, and drama ideally is best seen performed, you'd be seeing Oedipus help the priest up. But then what he says is, "Speak up, old man. Your years, your dignity, you should speak for others. Why here and kneeling? What preys upon you so? Some sudden fear? Some strong desire? You can trust me, I am ready to help. I'll do anything. I would be blind to misery, not to pity my people kneeling at my feet." So I chose this passage because, like I said, the priest then responds about the plague, and this launches the narrative with Oedipus with his goal. But I think there's some passages here that are really helpful, especially where he says, "You can trust me. I'm ready to help. I'll do anything. I would be blind to my misery, not to pity my people kneeling at my feet." So he's a king, which means he has people who are his citizens. He's responsible to them. Remember, the play is called Oedipus the King. And so he's got a priest here, one of his people, one of the citizens of Thebes, kneeling at his feet. And so he pledges here to help his people. "I am ready to help. You can trust me. I'll do anything." He basically says he would be wrong to not pity his people. So again, that's the Greek word translated for pity, reminiscent of our discussion of catharsis, right? He's not saying I feel sorry for my people. He's saying I identify with my people. I'm one of them. I need to help them. So Oedipus is at the beginning of the story a very empathetic character. He's already kind of the man that you could say Achilles becomes at the end of the Iliad. And so for me, to answer this question, that does make him someone I would root for. I like this guy. He's not a corrupt king taking advantage of his people. He's a king who wants to help his people. And he becomes, you could say, as the text goes on, not necessarily in this passage, but we know from reading the whole text that he becomes, you could say, relentless in pursuing what he sees as justice. Now, it becomes very tragic as it goes, and we can start to infer that he is actually the cause of the plague, which will lead us to our next point, irony. But that dogged pursuit of the truth and justice to help his people, even as misguided as it becomes later on, is something I think most people really identify with and really value. This is very intentional on Sophocles' part because he wants us to pity Oedipus. He wants us to sympathize and empathize with Oedipus. And so he has to make someone like Oedipus very relatable and likable from the beginning. To contrast this with the example of the Iliad we had in lesson, or part 2 of this lesson, it takes the entire Iliad for Achilles to become someone we like and respect because that's an epic, a different genre. This is a tragedy. For a tragedy to work, you have to like and respect the character from the beginning. This passage helps establish that. So what I've just done is focus on specific words in this passage like trust, help, pity, kneeling at my feet. And I've used those words to say these words show that Oedipus is someone we respect and root for at the start of the text. That's my argument on this slide. So that's an example of using the words to support an argument. That's an example of close reading. And in your discussion board posts, since they're about 250 words, I'll be looking for you to do some close reading, to use quotes from the text to prove your point. And your papers, which you'll do at midterm and at the end of the quarter, that'll be your primary evidence. Not plot summary or analysis of plot, but close reading analysis of language from the text. Like I use specific language here to prove your point. So we have an impression of Oedipus's character, and we have the launching of the narrative here, the pursuit of the cause of the plague, the dogged, relentless pursuit to root out the plague and stop it by Oedipus. Let's see what happens. So my next point was irony, and my question here is, how does Sophocles, the author, use irony for dramatic effect? So that term dramatic effect refers to the effect a play has on you as you watch it. Again, thinking of genre, watching a play is different than reading a novel because it only takes like a few hours, and that means it really has to engross you in the drama. That's why plays or tragedies specifically are so ripe for catharsis. But irony is very important here. So irony, like catharsis, is another term we're going to reclaim from our culture. And when we use irony in our culture today, we say things like, well, I was planning to have a picnic, but now it's raining. That's ironic. Well, it's just a coincidence that it was raining. You know, it's not like that was intentional. And so that's kind of a misuse of irony. That's how we've come to use it culturally. That's fine. I'm not saying don't use it that way. I'm saying understand that's the English translation of the word. We're looking at the Greek here. And in Greek, what irony means is when an author has something going on beneath the surface of a text, and that is the opposite of what we think is going on or what we see as going on at the surface level. And that's come to be known because of how we use the word incorrectly today. That's become known as literary irony. And so Sophocles essentially invented literary irony when he wrote Oedipus. And because the dramatic effect, the catharsis, is so powerful in Oedipus, the irony makes it even more dramatic, even more possible. So the irony is Oedipus, like we said on the last slide, is relentlessly and doggedly pursuing the cause of the plague. What people familiar with the myth knew at the time was that he was the cause of the plague. So on the surface, he's trying to root out the cause of the plague. Beneath the surface, he is the cause of the plague. That makes it irony. That makes it more suspenseful as he's trying to figure it out, being like a detective here. That makes it more tense and dramatic as the audience starts to realize this and how tragic the ending's going to be because of this irony. So here's a quote that reveals the irony. I order you, every citizen of the state, where I hold throne and power, banish this man. Whoever he may be, never shelter him. Never. Never speak a word to him, never make him partner. To your prayers, your victims burn to the gods. Never let the holy water touch his hands. Drive him out, each of you, from every home. He is the plague, the heart of our corruption, as Apollo's oracle has just revealed to me. So I honor my obligations. I fight for the god and for the murdered man. So what Oedipus has learned at this point is that the previous king, Laius, was murdered. And because his murder has not been found out, that's why the plague is affecting the citizens. And so what Oedipus now knows is he wants to root out this murderer. And so he's pursuing the murderer now with the same relentless, dogged pursuit. And so here, if we know the background and we know that Oedipus is actually the one who killed Laius, that he's actually the murderer, this becomes very ironic, very tragic, very tense, very dramatic, because he's going to great lengths. The him here, the pronoun him that he uses continually and repeatedly, refers to the murderer. We just don't know he's actually talking about himself. That's what's ironic. And so this is where we really start to see that transition of Oedipus from someone who we respect and honor to someone that we might pity because he's trying to root out himself. And that phrase "burn to the gods" just refers to the sacrifices, because this was a polytheistic pagan culture. They made sacrifices to the gods, which was very common in religious practices throughout the ancient world. But he's basically saying this person is a non-person now because they've not only murdered the king, they've caused this plague. They should be exiled, driven out, drive him out. But that's part of the irony, because he wants to drive out the murderer. We'll see what eventually happens to Oedipus on this last thread slide before we move on to the learning questions. So we've seen Oedipus as someone we respect because of his relentless, dogged pursuit of the truth and justice. We've started to see the tragedy of the play when we realize that the answer to justice may be himself. Now we see the full-on tragedy at the end of the play, which is where blindness comes into play. So Oedipus learns the truth that he killed his father, Laius, married his mother, and then sired 4 children with her. And so we know that his mother and father wanted to avoid the prophecy that he would do this, so they sent him away as a baby, but they didn't kill him. They couldn't bring themselves to do that. We know that Oedipus grew up and heard the prophecy himself and thought mistakenly that his adopted parents were his biological parents. So he ran from them to avoid the prophecy. Ironically, he ran right toward where he was originally born, encountered his father on the road and murdered him, and fulfilled the prophecy. And the prophet Tiresias has been trying to say, don't be so relentless. You won't like the truth you're about to hear. And then once he hears the truth, he gouges out his eyes. So what does blindness represent? What I did was best, blinding himself. Don't lecture me. No more advice. I, with my eyes, how could I look my father in the eyes when I go down to death, the underworld? Or mother, so abused. I have done such things to the 2 of them. Crimes too huge for hanging. Worse yet, the sight of my children, born as they were born. How could I long to look into their eyes? No, not with these eyes of mine, never. Nor this city either, her high towers, the sacred glittering images of her gods. I am misery, I her best son reared, as no other son of Thebes was ever reared. I've stripped myself, I gave the command myself. All men must cast away the great blasphemer, the curse now brought to light by the gods, the son of Laius, I, my father's son. So here when he says, I gave the command myself, he means the command to exile whoever the murderer was. He is now at the end of the play learned the murderer is indeed himself. So he must follow the command he gave himself and be cast out. And so irony is just present all throughout. And so it's very dramatic and tense. But the blindness is really key here, right? Because he could literally see before, but the prophet Tiresias, who was warning him, was literally blind, but could see the truth because he was a prophet. So Oedipus could literally see, but was figuratively blind, where conversely the prophet Tiresias was literally blind but could figuratively see. Now Oedipus knows the truth and he can't bear to look at it, so he blinds himself. And remember, we used blindness as an example, with King Lear as an example, when we were talking about catharsis in part 2 of the lecture. So blindness is really important here. And I think, as shocking as it may seem, this is a cathartic moment. This is a wondrous moment, because people kept warning Oedipus not to pursue truth so relentlessly. And on the one hand, at the beginning, we respect him for his relentlessness, but later, as we get further and Jocasta starts to figure it out, and she loves him in 2 ways, as a son and as a husband. She says, spare yourself from the truth. The prophet Tiresias warns him, but he keeps going. And when he berates and is wicked to Tiresias, we lose a little bit of respect for him. Whereas in an epic with like the Iliad with Achilles starts at the bottom and works his way up. And a tragedy with Oedipus starts at the bottom, goes down, and then comes back up. And so when he berates Tiresias and doesn't listen to Jocasta, we start to lose respect for him there. But here, in blinding himself, we have a moment which is kind of like the moment for Achilles at the end of the Iliad, where now Oedipus sees. In the Iliad, Achilles could only see himself. At the end, he could see others. Here, Oedipus was blinded by his pride. Now his eyes are open, and he figuratively blinds himself. So he understands now the importance, perhaps, of listening to others, that sometimes the truth can be destructive. These are big realizations for him, but the blindness is a moment, perhaps, you could argue, of wonder. And this leads us to, now we're going to transition to our discussion board, our learning questions, because I think I've given you a good basis with the idea that catharsis leads to wonder. And we certainly pity Oedipus here, we can empathize with him, and we certainly fear that something similar may happen to us. And could the blindness be the moment of wonder? I'm not going to just outright say yes to that, because I want to hear from you on the discussion board what potentially could be the moment of wonder. So with that, now we transition to the learning questions, which are the questions you can choose from, just one, to answer on the discussion board. And we haven't talked about our 4th thread yet, which was fate. So fate is actually the first topic I bring up for a learning question. I think this is a play that's all about fate. It's about a prophecy. We could think there could have been ways Oedipus could have escaped the prophecy, right? He could have not left Corinth when he found out about the prophecy. Trying to run away from the prophecy is what ironically leads him right to it. And so maybe there's a message for the ancient Greeks in here about not trying to avoid your fate, because they were a very fatalistic culture. Could Oedipus have avoided his fate if he'd stayed in Corinth, or if he'd chosen not to kill the man on the road? I don't know. But I think a bigger question is this idea of fate here shows that suffering is inevitable. We can't escape suffering. No matter how good our lives are, we will suffer at some point. So knowing that we can't escape suffering, how does that perhaps help us deal with it better in a more productive way? Perhaps in a way better than Oedipus does, right? Because that's part of where we lose respect for him, perhaps, is when he tries to run away from his fate. He tries to avoid suffering instead of accepting suffering. So that's a first question for you to meditate on. The second question has to do with pity and empathy. Oedipus has, his name in Greek means two things, no foot and swell foot. And he has these strange feet because of when they were bound when he was a baby, when his mom was trying to get rid of him. And so on the one hand, maybe we can relate to Oedipus, right? He suffers and we've suffered. But on the other hand, his particular struggle is very different from our own. And so we probably never have be facing a prophecy like this. So he's both a relatable and unrelatable character at the same time. No foot and swell foot. And this is important because in the article that explained the meaning of catharsis, the author argued that a hero of a drama has to be unique. And Oedipus is like a myth, a legend. But at the same time, we have to be able to relate to their struggle. So how does this kind of dual aspect of Oedipus make him like the ideal protagonist for a tragedy? And how do you relate to him? I mean, his struggle is very different from our own. So I'm curious of how you might be able to relate to him. Thirdly, the play takes place, I mentioned this before, this would be kind of another thread, not in chronological order. It starts with the investigation of the plague, and we get Oedipus's backstory later on. So the ancient Greeks knew his backstory, and the myth has become so famous in Western culture. You may have as well, but you may not have. So you may have learned it as it went. So it begins what we call in media res in the middle. And this makes it very suspenseful because we start to learn the backstory. It gets more tense and dramatic. And so I asked, what was your reading experience like? How did it perhaps, this structure beginning in the middle and then hearing the backstory, how did this structure perhaps add suspense, tension, or even horror to your reading experience? Because this is kind of a horror story. And then how does that building of the suspense and tension or horror, how does that perhaps help Sophocles make that transition where the tragedy eventually gives way to catharsis and wonder and beauty? I think is part of it. So I'm curious of what you think about how that process might work. Just a few more for you to consider. Remember, you just have to pick one. At the end of the play, do you feel pity for Oedipus? So here I'm trying to really draw on the idea of catharsis we learned about in part 2. And so by pity, I mean the Greek meaning of the word empathy. Like, are you able to empathize with him here? And because some people, I think, would struggle. Oedipus' story is somewhat horrific and grotesque and unique. So not everyone may feel empathy or pity for him. But if you do, I think this question is really important and you might choose it. Because the author of the article argued that this empathy or pity gives way to something wondrous. The playwright uses it to teach us something wondrous. So the question then is, if you do feel pity or empathy for Oedipus, what wondrous thing is Sophocles, the author, teaching you through this pity he evokes in you for Oedipus? Finally, the last couple questions are very succinct here. I went over this concept of catharsis in part 2 of this lesson. So seeing Oedipus as a case study, did it help you understand that lecture material better? And how so, if it did? Finally, coming back to the idea of suffering, like I said, suffering is something we all experience. It's inevitable. But coming back to that that quote from the Bible about how suffering produces endurance, which produces character, which produces hope, that's tough to accept. It's tough to accept that maybe we're meant to suffer, and that maybe, like that quote from the Bible says, we could even rejoice in it. That's a pretty perplexing idea. And so I'm curious where Oedipus might help you land with that idea, if it's something you've considered. So learning about catharsis, reading Oedipus, then seeing the theory and practice and action, seeing catharsis and action in Oedipus, has that given you new insight to suffering? Is that helpful in dealing with this question of what do we do with our suffering? Does catharsis, specifically catharsis on display in Oedipus, does it help with that question? So this is my take on Oedipus. I think these questions will be able to launch you into other takes, other opinions, and like I said, I really look forward to reading them. So hopefully this kicks off what will be a great quarter of discussion, and I look very much look forward to engaging in discussion with you on the discussion board and reading what you have to say about the text.